I was struck by what a bright and beautiful girl she was. She said, well, to tell you the truth, I had an assignment, which was to interview Albert Schweitzer, and I skipped it and went out with you. So I had to marry her.
There was a time when a single face could define what dignity looked like. For many, that face belonged to Gregory Peck. He stood for something rare, quiet strength, measured words, and a kind of integrity that didn't need to announce itself. On screen, he was unforgettable. Off-screen, he was harder to understand, because behind the calm presence and steady voice was a man who loved more than once, deeply, differently, and sometimes quietly. Some of those relationships faded with time. Some were never fully explained. But before the end of his life, one truth remained. Only one woman truly held his heart. And perhaps, in remembering his story, you may find yourself remembering something of your own. Before we dive into the private heart of this Hollywood legend, tell me, what is the one Gregory Peck movie you can watch over and over again? Let me know in the comments. The life he thought would last. Greta Kukkonen. Before the fame, before the recognition, before the world began to see him as a symbol of quiet strength, there was a simpler life. And in that life stood Greta Kukkonen. They met at a time when everything still felt uncertain. Gregory Peck was not yet a legend, just a young man trying to find his place, balancing ambition with doubt. Greta, composed and intelligent, brought something steady into his world. She wasn't drawn to glamour. She was drawn to the man behind it. Their marriage, in many ways, represented the life he thought he would live. A grounded life. A private one. The kind of life built not on attention, but on quiet understanding. For a while it worked. They built a family together. They shared years that were not yet shaped by the pressures of Hollywood. And in those early days, there was something genuine, something untouched by expectation. But success has a way of changing the rhythm of a life. As Gregory Peck's career began to rise, the demands grew heavier. Long filming schedules, public attention, emotional distance that no one could quite name, but both could feel. It wasn't sudden. It rarely is. It was gradual, almost invisible at first. The conversations became shorter, the silences longer, and somewhere between who he was becoming and who he used to be, something began to slip away. Some distances don't begin with conflict. They begin with quiet. By the time the world fully embraced Gregory Peck, the life he once imagined, steady, simple, certain, was already beginning to fade. And though neither of them could have known it then, this was only the beginning of a much longer, more complicated story of love. A bond beyond the screen. Ingrid Bergman. By the time Gregory Peck shared the screen with Ingrid Bergman, he was no longer the uncertain young man searching for direction. He had become a presence, measured, composed, quietly powerful. And Ingrid Bergman, she was something else entirely. There was an emotional intelligence in her performances that felt almost disarming. She didn't just act, she revealed. And when the two came together during Spellbound, something rare took shape between them. Not loud, not dramatic, but deeply felt. It showed in the way they looked at each other on screen. It lingered in the pauses between lines. Audiences saw chemistry, but what existed beneath it was something more subtle. Mutual understanding. Both carried a seriousness about their craft. Both understood the weight of expectation. And perhaps more importantly, both knew what it meant to live between public admiration and private uncertainty. Their connection was never defined in the way Hollywood often demands. There were no grand declarations, no headlines that captured the full truth. Only moments, conversations that lasted longer than expected, silences that didn't feel empty, a shared rhythm that made everything around them seem quieter. But life, as it often does, moved forward. Ingrid Bergman's own path would take her far from that moment in time, and Gregory Peck, still navigating the growing complexities of his personal life, continued forward as well. Whatever existed between them remained where it began. Unspoken. Unclaimed. Some connections are not meant to last, only to be remembered. And yet, for Peck, it was another chapter, another feeling, that quietly shaped his understanding of what love could be, and what it sometimes could not become. A dangerous kind of attraction. Barbara Payton. By the early 1950s, Gregory Peck had already become a symbol of control, on screen and in life. His presence carried restraint, a kind of emotional discipline that audiences trusted. But not every chapter of a life follows that same rhythm. And then there was Barbara Payton. She represented something entirely different. Where Peck was measured, she was unpredictable. Where he was quiet, she was intense. There was a reputation that followed her, one shaped by chaos, headlines, and a life lived without the same careful boundaries. And perhaps that was part of the pull. Their connection, as remembered through time, was never clearly defined. It wasn't built on stability or long conversations about the future. It existed more in moments, brief, charged, and difficult to fully explain. For a man like Peck, who had spent much of his life maintaining control, this kind of emotional contrast could feel disorienting. Not necessarily love, but something close enough to leave an impression. There are times in life when people don't represent who we are, but rather something we don't fully understand within ourselves. And Barbara Payton, in many ways, stood in that space. The world around them saw stories, speculation, fragments of something that didn't quite fit the image Gregory Peck had built. But behind those fragments was something quieter, a reminder that even the most composed lives have moments that don't align so neatly. It didn't last. It couldn't. Some connections are not meant to be kept, only to be learned from. And for Peck, this chapter, however brief, became another contrast, another understanding, that not every powerful connection leads to something lasting, and not everything that feels intense is meant to stay. Grace, distance, and what never was. Audrey Hepburn. There are some connections in life that never fully become anything, and yet they stay with us longer than those that do. When Gregory Peck met Audrey Hepburn during the making of Roman Holiday, he was already an established name. She, on the other hand, was just beginning to step into a spotlight that would soon change her life forever. From the very beginning, there was something unmistakable about her. Not just beauty, but a kind of gentleness, a quiet grace that didn't ask for attention, yet naturally drew it in. Peck saw it immediately. In fact, he insisted that her name be given equal prominence in the film, something rare, especially for a newcomer. That gesture alone said more than words ever could. Between them, there was admiration, respect, a warmth that felt effortless. Their on-screen chemistry was undeniable, but off-screen, it carried a softer tone, something unspoken, carefully held within boundaries neither of them chose to cross. Timing has a way of deciding things for us. Peck was still navigating the complexities of his personal life. Audrey was at the beginning of hers, and perhaps both understood, without needing to say it, that whatever existed between them belonged to a moment, not a future. Still, moments can leave a mark. There are people we meet who don't become part of our lives, but somehow become part of who we are. Not every love story is meant to be lived. Some are only meant to be felt. For Gregory Peck, Audrey Hepburn was not a chapter of conflict or loss, but something quieter, a reminder that sometimes the most beautiful connections are the ones we choose not to change, because deep down, we know they are already complete. The Woman Who Lived Without Limits, Ava Gardner. By the time Gregory Peck had fully stepped into his place among Hollywood's most respected figures, He had already experienced different kinds of connection, some steady, some uncertain, some quietly unfinished. And then there was Ava Gardner. She was unlike anyone else. Where others carried grace or restraint, Ava carried freedom, a presence that refused to be shaped, a spirit that moved without hesitation. She lived as she felt, openly, passionately, and without apology. In a world that often demanded control, she represented the exact opposite. And that contrast was impossible to ignore. For Peck, whose life had been defined by discipline and careful choices, Ava Gardner's world must have felt both fascinating and distant at the same time. There was admiration, certainly, perhaps even a quiet curiosity, about what it meant to live without the weight of constant restraint. But admiration does not always become closeness. Some people enter our lives not to stay, but to show us a different way of being, a different rhythm, a different kind of freedom that we may never fully choose, but never quite forget. Their paths crossed within the same world, one built on lights, cameras, and expectation. Yet emotionally, they stood in very different places. Peck remained who he had always been, measured, thoughtful, inward. Ava remained untamed, guided by instinct rather than reflection. Not every connection is meant to align. Some exist only in contrast, and perhaps that was the truth of it. Ava Gardner did not become a central chapter in Gregory Peck's emotional life, but she represented something important, something he could see, respect, and quietly step away from. Because by now, whether he fully realized it or not, his heart was already beginning to move toward something else. The woman who changed everything, Veronique Passani. By the time Gregory Peck met Veronique Passani, his life had already been shaped by different kinds of connection, some steady, some uncertain, some that quietly faded with time. But this felt different from the beginning. She was not part of his world in the way others had been, not an actress, not drawn to the spotlight. Veronique came from a different space entirely, thoughtful, observant, and grounded in a way that didn't compete with his life, but seemed to understand it. There was no need for performance, no need to impress. With her, Gregory Peck did not have to carry the weight of who the world expected him to be. And perhaps, after everything he had experienced, that was exactly what he needed. Their connection wasn't built on intensity or mystery. It grew quietly, naturally, through conversation, through presence, through a kind of emotional ease that doesn't demand attention, but lasts. For the first time in a long while, there was clarity. Not confusion, not contrast, not distance, just something real. Some loves don't arrive with noise. They arrive with certainty. And as their relationship deepened, it became clear that this was not just another chapter. It was a shift, a turning point in a life that had seen many versions of connection, but not always understanding. Veronique Passani didn't represent a moment. She represented something lasting. And though the world may not have fully understood it at the time, Gregory Peck, quietly and without hesitation, did. The love of his life, Veronique Passani. In the final years of his life, when time had softened everything, ambition, memory, even the weight of past choices, Gregory Peck was no longer defined by the roles he had played. What remained was simpler than that. Not the applause, not the legacy, but love. He had known different kinds of connection throughout his life, some shaped by youth, some by admiration, some by curiosity or even contrast. Each had left its mark in its own way, quietly contributing to the man he became. But only one remained untouched by time. Veronique Passani was not just a chapter in his story. She was the place where all the searching seemed to end. Their life together was not built on intensity, nor on fleeting emotion. It was built on understanding, on patience, on a quiet kind of loyalty that doesn't need to be proven, only lived. Through the years, through the changes, through the moments that life inevitably brings, she was there. Not as a figure beside him, but as someone who stood with him. There is a difference. The love that lasts is rarely the loudest. It is the one that stays. And perhaps, in those final reflections, whether spoken aloud or simply understood within, Gregory Peck knew something with complete certainty, that after everything, after all the people, all the moments, all the paths his life had taken, there was only one woman who had truly held his heart, not for a moment, not for a season, but for a lifetime. And in the end, that was the only truth that remained. In the end, the life of Gregory Peck was not only defined by the roles he played, but by the love he chose to keep. Not every connection lasts. Not every feeling becomes a lifetime. But sometimes, quietly and without noise, one person remains. And perhaps, as you reflect on his story, you may find yourself thinking of someone too. Someone who stayed, or someone who didn't. Because in the end, we are remembered, not for how much we had, but for what truly mattered. If this story meant something to you, take a moment to like the video, share it with someone who remembers these days, and subscribe for more timeless stories like this. And tell me in the comments, do you believe we only truly love once?